Hello and welcome to the Ecomodernist channel live. My name's Carl Pauls and I'm here with Gabriel Lignetti. Today, our special guest, Darell Bricker, is a prolific author. He's written several national best-selling books. He holds a Ph.D. in political science from Carleton University, where he was a Social Science Research Council Doctoral Fellow. He's here to speak with us today about his book, Empty Planet: The Shock of Global Population Decline. Welcome, Darell. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's Darell Bricker, by the way.
Bricker. Oh, okay. I knew I would stumble over something. Darell Bricker. There we go. So, what is the basic thesis of Empty Planet?
My co-author and I, John Ebbetson, wrote Empty Planet. Basically, what it is a challenge to prevailing what we call vertical knowledge, which is the thing that everybody knows that happens to be wrong. And the thing that everybody knows that happens to be wrong is that the global population is exploding. The UN, at the time we were writing the book, was telling us that we're going to reach 11.2 billion people by the end of the century. How are we possibly going to sustain the Earth? And how are we possibly going to sustain humanity? The thing that's wrong is that that's going to happen. It's not going to happen. The population is probably going to peak somewhere between 8 and 9 billion sometime mid-century, and start to decline after that. And the real challenge is not going to be a population explosion. It's going to be a population implosion. Humanity, frankly, is a very delicate species, far more delicate than we acknowledge. Within 100 years, if we all start to stop reproducing, and that's basically what's happening right now, is we're stopping reproduction, humanity doesn't exist. So the question is, what is our future going to look like in an environment in which people have decided, and it's really a decision, to stop having kids? So if you look at the United States, for example, a year ago recorded its lowest fertility rate in a century. It was down to 1.6. Now, to have just a replacing population, that's just replacing the number of people who are dying on an annual basis, just to hold the population steady, we need to have a birth rate in developing countries of about 2.1. That's one for you, one for your partner, and a little bit extra for those kids who don't make it to adulthood. So the replacement rate's 2.1. The United States, it was 1.6. I'm speaking to you from Canada today. It's 1.4. Now, here's the shocking part, because everybody assumes that there's all sorts of other places in the world that are having lots and lots and lots of kids. Well, the current birth rate for China, as recorded by the UN and admitted by the Chinese government, is 1.2. India this week put out a new report about its population growth through this century and has reduced the amount of time in which the population is going to be growing by a decade. So by mid-century, a population decline is going to start, and their official birth rate is 2.0. Between India and China, the two largest countries in the world, that's 36% of the global population. They're not having replacement rate birth rates. You go to Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, most of those countries are below replacement rate. You go to Europe, many countries in Europe are already in population decline. Italy loses 165,000 people from its population every year. Japan loses 650,000 people from its population every year. The only place that has really consistent above rate population replacement rate birth rate now is Africa, but it's coming down quite dramatically as well. So this is a global phenomena. It's happening in every single country. There's no country that's actually adding to its fertility rate. In other words, the number of kids they're having is actually expanding. So when I hear projections like the world is going to get to 11.2 billion, by the way, that was 5 years ago in 2017. The UN put out a new projection in 2022 for what it's going to be in 2100, and their new projection is 10.4 billion people. So they brought it down in 5 years by 800 million people. And India right now is saying that its population by the end of the century, this is the Indian government, is going to come down 100 million, even more than is in the UN projections. So that's why Empty Planet is really describing what our future is going to be, because it's based on data. And these are the statistics about what's happening with global fertility and the population implications.
So what's causing this?
Choice. It's basically people deciding that they don't want to have families the size of families that they used to have in the past. And it's really driven by a couple of things. One of them is the huge process of urbanization. So back in 1960, 2/3 of the global population lived in rural areas. Today, almost 60% of the global population lives in urban areas. When you move from the country to the city, the way that you look about the size of your family changes. In the countryside, these are useful assets on the farm. Lots of kids, lots of useful production on the farm. When you move to the city, they're merely expensive. They don't contribute to the economic, I would say, resilience of the family, at least in the short term. So as a result of that, you make an economically rational decision and you have fewer. And so that's one element. But the really big reason is the lives of women change. When they move from the country to the city, they get more access to education, more access to participate in the economy, and they start making different decisions about their lives. And they decide they want to have a different life than their grandmother or maybe even their mother had, which means that if they get married at all, they want to get married later. And if they want to start a family at all, they want to start their family later because they're preserving that first part of their adulthood for the purposes of gaining an education and also gaining a career. And when you delay all these things, you inevitably create a situation in which fewer children is the most likely outcome, and that's what's happening.
I actually use this as part of my pitch here in the liberal progressive enclave of Seattle. Like the pitch for a high energy society is it emancipates women. It gives women choice. And you're saying that this choice has historically led to the decision for a smaller family because children in an urban environment are an economic cost rather than a benefit. And because of our social safety nets, the consequence of freedom, where we're not struggling to survive as a family unit, that is reinforcing these decisions in some way?
Well, it's the whole purpose of a family is changing. If you look at the most common type of family in my country right now in Canada, and I'm sure it's very similar in the United States, it's people living on their own. Mm-hmm. And it's also the fastest growing family unit. So two biologically different parents with kids in the house is actually not the most common type of family in Canada right now. It's a person living on their own. So at the beginning of their adulthood and at the end of their lives.
They're finding out that internet and social media, there's less dating by men. Their interactions are virtual rather than physical, and that is causing a decline in relationships between men and women and actually developing into marriages and things like that. I don't know if you covered that at all, but it's pretty well documented, actually.
Yeah, no, there's a whole series of theories about why this is happening. This is one of them. But when you look at the data and you look at what's most highly correlated to declining fertility levels, it's actually the increasing educational levels of women. There's a very, very direct correlation. And all of this leads to a situation in which everything that relates to the formation of families is pushed later. And the truth is, with the creation of human beings, we only do it in the old-fashioned way. And as a result of pushing everything later, the risks of not being able to actually be successful are higher. But you can also combine that with other theories that are out there, and there's some pretty good science behind this, that our ability to actually reproduce based on environmental pollutants, basically, and the effect that it's having on sperm counts and miscarriages is also increasing after time. Somebody that I've been on a few panels with named Shauna Swan has written a book called Countdown, in which she does a very thorough job of going through this. Now, you could argue whether she's right or she's wrong, but it's just one more factor. But all of these things that we're mentioning here are all mitigating against the creation of families for the purposes of having kids and the actual production of children. There's nothing that's pushing up the likelihood that people are going to have more children, which is the issue. So, John and I, when we wrote the book, we said 4 years ago that we're not saying it's a good thing, we're not saying it's a bad thing, but we're saying it's an important thing and people need to understand it. We've now kind of shifted our view, and it's actually, given the speed at which all of this is happening, it's actually becoming a bad thing. It's a problem.
Interesting. I had to look that book up. It's Shauna, Shanna, Swan.
Yeah, it's called Countdown.
So I just Want to put that here up on screen for our audience so you can look that up.
Now, you say that the UN projections of population increases are inaccurate. What are you basing that on?
My day job is I'm the CEO of a company called Ipsos Public Affairs. We're the largest social research company in the world. And my training is in statistics. And so that's what I go look at. And I looked at the data, and their model is a very simple model. It is a combination of three variables: estimates of fertility rates, estimates of death rates, and estimate of migration rates. All of it's looking in the rearview mirror. So they look at what previous situations were, and they look at the correlations among those three variables within countries. And where they don't have data, they just project what's happening in a country that's similar over to that other to the country that they don't have data with. And they have this very conservative model of how these factors interact. And the suggestion is the only thing that contributes to whether or not we have a fertility rate of a certain level, and then after that, what the population size is going to be, is how these three things interact. And it's just not true. The truth is that culture is a really huge part of all of this, and there's nothing about it in the model, and it's all happening right now. It's not something that just happened in the past. So the problem that they have in their model, I'll give you a good example of this, and for those statisticians or demographers, you'll probably scream when I say this, but the population momentum argument, which is the idea that there's a lot of young people coming into the population in places like India, and also places like the United States, but also in Africa. So what they're going to do is they're going to cause a big increase in fertility. So what we're going to do is get to that 10.4 billion number because of this population momentum. It's inevitable that these people are going to cause a big burst in birth rates, except they're not. They're not. And the reason they're not is because this group is not behaving the same as their peer group in the past. They're having fewer kids. They're starting their families later. It's the culture around fertility has changed. So as a result of that, if you're assuming that that's what's going to happen in the future, that's how you get to 10.4 billion people. But any model in which you, in the space of 5 years, 2017 to 2022, change your estimates by almost a billion people, 800 million, is not a model that's working. There's a problem. So all you have to do is go look at the data. Go take a look at, for example, their estimates for Eastern and Central Europe, the NATO countries, for example. They have, through the course of the 21st century, all of them, they go down a little bit, but then they start to come back up. Based on what? It's not happening. And it's not enough variables. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
They don't have enough variables. They're not covering off the right variables. And as I said before, they're mostly, in my view, related to culture.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I think that we in sort of the eco-modernist camp like to say that culture fundamentally doesn't matter as much as technological change. And the hypothesis is that technological change is an enabler of social change. But perhaps
you're backwards, in
right?
my view.
Well, of course, maybe in the 21st century we are absolutely backwards, because in the 20th century I think there might have been a good case for that. But what you're saying is that we're taking these 20th century ideas and carrying them forward inappropriately. We need to have a reset in our thinking. We need to consider that maybe these ideals and these ideas of cultural change have greater effects than we thought they had in the past.
Yeah, they do. And what I will say about why I think it's the other direction, and we could have a discussion about that too, is because I think technology, as the people who are creating it believe it's going to be adopted by the human population, tend to be wrong. And I'll give you a great example. The mechanism that we're on right now, the internet. When it was originally developed, it was, developed for the purposes of, keeping a stable communications environment for a combination of military and academic researchers. Did anybody conceive of Netflix or what the porn industry was going to do with online activity? No, nobody did. Because what happens is human beings take on these things and they modify them. They adapt them to the lives that they're living, and they use it in many times in ways that the people who invented it never intended. So I actually think culture is the thing that trumps everything. It's how human beings decide to bring technology into their lives. And we have a very poor way of projecting it. I mean, if you go back, my favorite thing, and I wrote about this in another book I wrote called Next, which is just about Canada. So your audience probably isn't going to be interested in it. But I said, go back and take a look at, read Jules Verne, or go back and read H.G. Wells, or go back and take a look at the videos that you can find online about what the 21st century was going to be like. And show me the flying cars, or this isn't what's happened. We're not very good at understanding what the effects of technology are going to be, or how human beings are going to use it in their lives, in my view.
Understanding the impact of culture, the changing demographics, and these projections for future population being smaller and growth being smaller than our 20th century thinking leads us to believe. What are the ramifications? What is the outcomes of this lower population growth?
Well, everything for the environment has got to be better. Everything. Because if we believe that there's a correlation between the size of the human population and human activity and things like climate change, everything that I'm talking about right now, you should be applying. Everything about how that we're using the world's water, everything about how we're using people's encroachment on the natural environment of nature, you should be applauding everything that I'm talking about. But if you're at all concerned about what the future of the global economy is going to be, or our ability to deal with the other major part of this, which is the rapidly aging population that we're going to have on the face of this earth as a result of what's going on, you have to be very, very worried. I mean, if you take a look at humanity and the growth of humanity, everything before 1950 is really not that interesting. I mean, we spend so much time going back and looking at human history prior to 1950, but the truth is it took us all of human history to 1950 to get to 2.5 billion people. And between 1950 and today, we got to 8 billion people. Almost all of the growth in humanity has taken place in that very short period of time. Within a century, 1950 to 2050, it's going to go up and it's going to come back down. It's the biggest story that's happening in the world, and nobody's talking about it. Well, we're talking about it, but virtually nobody else is. And to me, that's the really interesting part of this. And just as it was disruptive on the way up, it's going to be very disruptive on the way down. It's going to be like falling down a mountain in the middle of the night. We don't know what we're going to hit or what's going to happen. And almost nobody is preparing for this. I mean, if you went to Davos this year and you looked at the agenda, I didn't go to Davos, but I looked at the agenda. There was no discussion of population collapse or population aging. And the difference between that and just about everything else they're talking about in these places is there's a lot of speculation about what's going to happen. What's happening with this issue of population, you can mark it on the calendar. 2030, the entire global baby boom is going to be 65 years of age or older. 2050, we're all going to start dying. We can mark it on the calendar.
The zeitgeist of discussions about this is carrying forward that 20th century thinking. We had Paul Ehrlich on 60 Minutes less than a month ago. We've got Greta Thunberg shaking her finger at us for our focus on economic growth and consumerism. And maybe she's right about the finger wag, but for the wrong reason, is that there will be no young consumers, as you point out in several things I looked at.
This is the biggest issue. We get really fixated on the workforce part of this, the labor force, the productivity part of it. That's actually the easy problem to solve. Just get people to work a little bit longer. You automate a few things. You use the technology that you guys know so well to do things better than we used to do before. But robots don't buy dinner.
Yeah.
So The question is, who's going to buy the cars? So you're environmentalist. Who's going to buy your electric bike? Who's going to buy whatever? Because old people are hoarders, young people are consumers. And there is fewer and fewer and fewer of this younger people who are starting their lives, starting their homes, starting their families, doing all the big consumption things that one does in their lives worldwide every year.
But is that really a problem? I mean, if there's
Yeah,
less
for
people,
the economy, it absolutely
yes,
is.
I agree with that. But I mean, okay, true. But if you have less demand, then you don't need as big an economy, right?
Yeah, but Gabriel, the problem is the only way that we've been able to make our population or our economy grow over time, or to be productive over time, is by bringing in people, particularly since the end of the Second World War, and creating a consumer economy. So yeah, sure, we could go back to hewing logs and drawing water, and going back to
I'm not saying that.
some other situation. But the truth is, what is going to happen? We don't know. Hardly anybody's talking about it. We're talking about it today, but I can assure you, very few people are talking about it, and very few people are preparing for it. But this is what the future is going to look like. Yeah. We're going to be struggling with this shrinking, aging population, trying to create the type of growth that's necessary in order to pay for dealing with that problem. I mean, The Economist a couple of weeks ago had an article. I can't remember, it was on the front page, but it was a prominent article. We're going to have 150 million people in this world in 2050 with dementia.
Yeah.
Who's preparing for that? And it's very, very, very costly. It's going to be complicated, and there's very few people talking about it.
Yeah.
That's what I worry about.
Tell me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that people, even educated people, don't see this. They're looking at the opposite problem. They're imagining like just population explosion and everything gets crazy in the other direction. I mean, I was in an environmental meeting with a lot of educated people, including some PhDs, and I said what you said even before you wrote the book, because I knew about that before. And like everybody just gasped. They couldn't believe I said that, you know?
Well, that's why we're still talking about this 4 years after the book came out, because people continue to gasp. Because before the book came out, it really wasn't acceptable to have this kind of a conversation. The first review that came out of Empty Planet, which was from a group called Population Matters. And, obviously they're very concerned about the growth of population. The opening part of it is, we haven't read this book, but we know we disagree with it.
Yeah.
This is time and time again what I see in political circles is, okay, you have a novel idea. We're going to take it back to the old thinking about these ideas and say, oh, you're saying the wrong thing. You must be my political adversary because you're saying the wrong thing about nuclear. You're saying the wrong thing about population. You're saying the wrong thing about technology. You're a bad guy. I have to discredit.
Yeah, and the problem is the facts are on the other side. I mean, that's the problem. The facts are on the other side. I mean, how do we know that? Well, 2017, 11.2 billion people. 2022, 10.4 billion people. And by the way, the UN adjusts its estimates every 2 years. And next year, they're going to adjust it down again. And next year, they're going to adjust it down again. And the year after, they're going to adjust it down again, because that's the reality of what's going on. And there's nothing that changes this around. All we can do is just live with it, prepare for it, and live with it.
I don't know. I have to give a little pushback, and you could correct me if I'm wrong. This seems like a hump, because that demographic of old people is people who are the result of a larger population growth. And when they die off, that problem won't exist. And another thing, too, is that, the automation is a problem in terms of eliminating jobs that people need, but yet people are being eliminated by this population decline at the same time. And also, when we bring in the projections on climate and the fact that in the center of the planet is where the people are very poor, and they need air conditioning and they can't afford it. And if you don't have air conditioning, even it'll get so you can't survive, is what it seems to be. And I was mentioning to Darrell about wet bulb temperature, meaning that people will not be able to live. Cities will not be able to even function. So what I'm getting at is that you're going to see a lot of immigration coming from the global south into a part of the world that's depopulated. It's going to be like an exodus, is what it seems to be, what this is all pointing at. So, I mean, when you put this all together, I mean, it doesn't seem like a bad thing that this is happening.
Well, if that's how we get there. But what I said at the start of the segment was, it's like falling down a mountain in the dark. So everything that you just said is very, very, very hard. It's very hard. So we've got a population, this bulge in the population that's aging. You don't age well. Most of the money that you spend on healthcare, pensions, social services, and everything happens in that latter part of your life. Going to be very, very difficult for a younger, shrinking population to pay for all of that. It's going to be very, very difficult. There's going to be a lot of potentially very difficult political battles fought over this. The immigration that you were talking about from the global south, if you look at the number one driver of nativist populism in the world today, it's that.
Yeah.
It's that. So what's happening at the southern border of the United States? Okay, imagine that now, except everybody coming in is African, because that's the only place where there's surplus population, or coming in from India, or coming in from anywhere in the global south. How well has that gone? Also very, very, very difficult. And then add in, once that older population ages out and leaves this mortal coil, as we all do, the population that follows it is also old. That's the part. It's not like we're in 1950 where the population pyramid looks like this. The population pyramid is actually squeezed in at the bottom and goes like this. It's almost like been turned upside down. We've flipped the pyramid. So the people who actually follow that bigger group is also going to be older. Like, we think millennials, everybody talks about millennials as this young group. No, the millennials are actually quite old. Millennials are moving into their 40s now. We're not talking about Gen Z. Well, Gen Z's a lot smaller than the millennial generation. So it's not like it's going to be like this perfect replication of what existed back in 1950 with the beautiful population pyramid when the baby boom dies off. No, the whole population pyramid is going to be pushed up, and the bottom part is going to be pinched in. And that's because every year we're having fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer kids. So it's going to be very, very difficult to manage as we fall down the hill and hit our head on every rock and go through all the disruptions that we're going to go through, which is why, guys, we have to start getting ready now. It was explosive on the way up. The baby boom, 1950 to today, has been explosive on the way up in ways that nobody could have predicted. It's going to be the same on the way down, and we need to start getting ready for it.
So it's like the Kurzweil singularity, but that's a singularity for AI. You're saying this is a singularity for our cultural and population shifts, in that we're just not prepared for the outcomes, and sort of like.
We're not even thinking that this is an issue. There are countries that are. I mean, Giorgia Meloni, the prime minister of Italy, is saying, in a couple of generations, Italy won't exist. They're facing it right now. Japan, they're going through the same thing. They're losing 650,000 people from their population every year. Their median age is 48.
Yeah. It's a cultural shift, because I've been in Italy twice, and what I'm seeing is less Italian and more Africans.
So how's that going over?
Yeah, I know. I think that.
And this is what I mean. It's a very,
Absolutely.
very, very difficult set of circumstances to deal with. So when you say, "Oh well, the global South is just going to move north," well, not that easy. Or the young people are going to replace the old people. Well, right. So there's a lot of rocks to hit before we get there.
So this is what advocating for what a lot of people will call realpolitik, and this is like, yes, this is going to happen, and you ignore the consequences at your own peril. It's not to say you're advocating for reactionary policies, but it is to say it doesn't matter. You need to be prepared for it. You need to be prepared to have either an integrated, educated society, or you need to be prepared for that political backlash. And there's only so much integration you can do to stymie that reactionary movement. There's only so much you can do in order to make us into a nice kumbaya melting pot. I mean, I am incredibly progressive, but I have to admit that we are not easily going to become a country of 1 billion Americans without some social strife. It is not something that we can use public programming and nice feeling philosophies in order to just magically solve that problem.
Yeah. I don't think that'll happen though, but
yeah, I know that book. I'm sorry, that book was nonsense. It's just nonsense.
Oh,
America will never get to 1 billion people.
I agree. Yes,
will not happen. You're going to be hard pressed to get to 400 million.
When we move into a automation driven economy, does that wipe away a lot of these problems with labor? And to relate to that, you've said in some of your talks that, well, we ought to be bringing in immigrants in an intelligent way. We ought to be qualifying the brightest, the most creative people in order to onboard the right people to help sustain our economy. Does automation and the right kind of immigration, does that reinforce a proper societal growth here in the West, in the global North? Is there yet hidden layers, hidden problems that we have yet to uncover?
Immigration is at the very best a short-term break on some of the things that we're talking about. It's not going to solve the problem. And the reason is because immigrants don't come in at the age of 0. I mean, they come in at typically around the age of, late 20s, through up to 40 or something like that. And there's a fair amount of immigration these days that is basically family reunification, people bringing in older members of their family to join them in the country that they become resident. So it's actually quite complicated. But the problem we're going to run into in immigration is right now where there's lots of immigrants, but we're going to start running out of them. Because the same phenomena that exists in places like Italy is already starting to exist in places like China. I mean, Canada, our biggest source of immigrants a few years ago was China. They're now a distant second behind India, but we know India's population is going to start to decline too. So it's going to be a short-term way of dealing with this. And yes, you can cream skim the potential immigrant population, but there's going to be competition for those people. The truth is, at some point, we're going to actually be looking for just about anybody, because just as you need engineers, you're also going to need people to take care of all of those folks who have dementia. And that's just, providing caregiving and that kind of thing. So I think we're going to get less picky over time because of the needs that we have for just simply providing the ability for personal care for the people who are going to need it. And we're going to have a huge, huge pressure on our healthcare system as a result of this. So I think it's going to be a complicated issue. And when you roll the politics into this, it becomes even more complicated, knowing what I know about the correlation between increasing rates of immigration in most countries, and then from that, increasing rates of nativist populism. It's a very, very difficult set of political circumstances to deal with. But I would say on politics in this, one of the fears that I have about all of this is it becomes hyper-political. Because there's 2 points of view that you can have about this. One of them is a very radical position on the right that's like sort of pro-natalist and really kind of, in some ways, pushing back against the agenda of women's empowerment that we've had, over the space, particularly of this last century, that's really, really toxic. But then on the other side, people perceiving the issue of this topic simply being about women's rights, or a very kind of aggressive position on the left about this, instead of looking at it as a real, existential problem that we're facing about what the future existence of humanity is going to be, and having an intelligent, nonpartisan, scientific discussion about the correlation between the lack of having kids and what our future is going to be. And maybe there's some way we can have a more intelligent conversation about what our future fertility is going to be, and that, actually having a family might be a good thing. It's a necessary thing, but you don't have to couch it in political or ideological terms.
Yeah. Speaking of Italy, to illustrate what you said, I just recently found out you could buy a whole village in Italy for a few $100,000.
Well, you can go to some places in Spain where they'll give it to you for €1, because they're going through the same thing. I think their number is 65,000. that they're losing every year. But rural Japan right now is a great example of this, where the situation has become so bad. The people are older and lonely in rural parts of Japan that they're actually putting full-size mannequins in bus shelters so people don't feel like they're sitting there by themselves. In fact, your listeners can look it up. There's pictures of this all over the place. Or, mannequins of children for the 2 kids who are in a particular class in a particular rural area so they don't feel like they're all by themselves. These are real things that are happening in the world today. They're not speculative. This is really happening, and what we're talking about right now is really going to happen. Because the decisions have already been made, guys. We're just living through them.
Yeah. We have this competition, this new Cold War between China and the United States. How does this affect that going forward in terms of the population declines in America and in China and in the West?
So one fact, and here's another one you can use to drop jaws as you go out and talk to people about this topic, is that the Chinese population is actually older than the American population. So the median age of someone in China today is 39. The median age of an American today is 38. And the Chinese population is the most rapidly aging large population in the world. We should be very nervous about China, not just because of its geopolitical and economic aspirations, but because of the desperation that they're facing in terms of the population crisis that they have. They're going to become old before they're rich enough to be old. Their labor force is collapsing. All of this adds up to really difficult circumstances for the Chinese government, and difficult circumstances internally for any government, particularly one that's authoritarian, suggests that maybe doing something externally as a distraction might be a good idea. So that's why China makes me really nervous. Who's going to win in the race between China and the United States? The race is already over. And the reason is because the American population has a birth rate of 1.6. People, more than 1 million people, legally immigrate into the United States every year. We're not even talking about irregular border crossings or anything like that. The United States is still attracting more people. People are net leaving China. Plus their birth rate is 1.2 and probably lower.
And this is something that I've suspected in the last 5 years. China has started embracing its nativist politics.
Well, I would say nationalist, but they're also really stuck in this situation where everything that you can try to get the population, the fertility curve to move back the other way, they're stuck in what demographers call the low fertility trap. Once you get stuck in it, you can't get out of it because it becomes a sociological norm for your society to have small families. So they're trying everything they can to reverse that. Every type of incentive that you can put in place. There's a great article in the New York Times about it today. And the problem is none of it's working. So they got rid of their one-child policy about 5 years ago. They brought in their two-child policy soon after that. Now they've got their three-child policy, and none of it's reversed. Anything that's happening in their population.
Great.
Yeah, they're in big trouble. They're in big trouble. Because the other dirty little secret is because of their one-child policy, there's 30 million women missing from the Chinese population,
right,
because of basically female infanticide. And the other thing is that China has an incredibly high sterilization rate. In fact, it's the preferred method of birth control in China. So even if they tried to turn it around,
they couldn't.
They can't.
Yeah.
Nobody talks about this stuff. In the last year, the New York Times has decided to start turning its attention to this topic. But it's been around for a lot longer than the last year.
Yeah. And if they opened their borders up and had a pro-immigration policy, I mean, that would be an ideal place for so many people to go. They got so many houses and stuff and apartments that they haven't even finished putting up.
Yeah, except the Han Chinese have a hard enough time with the Uyghurs.
Right.
How do you think they're going to deal with the whole African population moving into China?
The nationalist policy.
That's always
the same way the Koreans deal with it, the same way that the Japanese deal with it, the same way that people in Asia deal with it generally, is they make it incredibly hard for people to immigrate to those places.
I think it's a little, perhaps we're looking at true Chinese imperialism with their Belt and Road policy, is that we're looking at the Chinese investment bank developing in Africa and creating enclaves of wealth within Africa. Is that a winning strategy for China? Maybe
they're ahead of it. Maybe there's something that's happening here that is not quite transparent or understandable. But if you looked at the way that Japan dealt with its situation, with its aging, just said the median age in Japan's 48, and their declining labor force, is basically what they did was they syndicated the risk by moving a fair amount of their manufacturing offshore. So what they did was they dealt with their aging population by moving the productive capacity of their economy to places with younger populations that could deal with it. Maybe that's something that China is considering. Although I haven't seen a lot of Chinese manufacturing moving to these places. Chinese money's moving to these places, but I haven't seen Chinese manufacturing moving to those places. And by the way, again, like immigration, it's kind of a short-term strategy because all of the Asian countries that are around Japan are all aging now too. And in fact, places like South Korea has the lowest fertility rate, one of the lowest fertility rates, if not the lowest fertility rate in the world now. It's 0.8.
You say this is an existential crisis. I mean, we're always going to have babies. I mean, how does that turn into an existential crisis?
Well, when you create go from a world it's all about youth to all about being about old people and trying to manage the vagaries of aging in an aging population and a population that's not expanding and shrinking, it's kind of an existential crisis.
I mean, I'm talking about existential in terms of wiping out the human race. I think you said that in the beginning.
Yeah, well, it's not just me. I mean, there's a very good study that was done. I think the best study that's been done on fertility rates ever in the world that was done by the University of Washington, actually where you guys are, by an academic named Chris, I think his last name's Murray or Murphy. But they've done the best analysis of fertility rates around the world. And this was prior to COVID, which had an absolute crushing effect on fertility rates. But it was done prior to COVID, and their estimate for the end of the century for the global population was about 9.8 billion, which at the time was 1.4 billion fewer than what the UN had. But he's been arguing, give it a couple of centuries. If we don't turn this around, we could be in trouble. If we stop reproducing today, we don't exist in 100 years.
Okay, yeah, I found Christopher J.L. Murray, professor, IHME director, chair, Department of Health Metric Sciences.
Yep, did a great, amazing study and published in the Lancet magazine. And he's basically out there on the record saying, give it a couple of centuries and we're really going to be in trouble. I actually think it's not a couple centuries.
Can we reverse this with national collectivist policy? Can we subsidize childbearing, childcare? This is sort of the part of the Green New Deal is universal free healthcare subsidized by the government. Is that a solution to reverse our population decline?
No.
What if we push on that choice? What if we make it like you want to have children because you start saving society, so we will reward you for having children?
There's a number of countries that are doing that right now. The ones that are the most progressive on all of this are all the Nordic countries. So, 90 days of, or actually it's more than a year of maternity benefits, very generous childcare. I forget which Nordic country it is. If you have a kid in a stroller, you get to ride the bus for free. I mean, everything that you can think of to do, and they're below replacement rate. Hungary is the most aggressive in the world right now on this question. And, if you have four kids, you don't pay any taxes. They're subsidized, if you want to need a larger car for a larger family, they subsidize that. They've nationalized in vitro fertilization. They've made it a national problem, and they've made this a national resource. Their birth rate slid last year. China's going to spend a lot of money and create a lot of incentives to create a situation in which they hope more women will have children. We're past that. What we basically have to do now is create an environment in which, yes, we maximize all of the benefits that are available to people who choose to decide to have a family, rather than demonizing them for having kids. Actually suggest to them maybe it's a good idea for you to have kids if you want to have kids. Maybe that might slow things down, but we're kind of past the point of no return. There's nobody who's been able to figure out a way to create such an incentive structure that people will decide to start having 3 kids, because the only way the population grows is if you have 3. If you have 2, all you do is slow down the inevitable. Just replace you replace your partner. So you think about your own family situation, and you think about all of the friends that you have, particularly you, Carl, and how many of them have 3 kids? I mean, back in 1959 in the United States, at 3, you would have been almost one short of what the average was. Mm-hmm. The average.
Right. Right. In fact, thinking about my family, so my father's generation is a baby boom generation. He has 5 siblings. All of them have 2 kids. One of those families is sort of a quiverful, conservative evangelical, and they have 6, 7 kids. And
Yeah,
so
there's a higher correlation. There's a higher correlation between religion. That's one of the things we didn't talk about. The decline of religiosity in the world is also, if you're not having kids for the state and for God, because the patriarchy is telling you to have them, a woman says, you know what? I think I'd like a job. I think I'd like to read books. I think I'd like to have more choice about how I want to live my life. And by the way, if I start a family, I'm going to start it when I'm, 30, 32, 33. But of course, that creates a situation in which she thinks she's able to have kids. She very well might not be able to have kids. But for people to start thinking actually having kids is okay. Because right now you got people like Population Matters out there saying it's actually bad. You've got people out there saying, I'm not going to have kids because of the climate or whatever. And it's like, no, have a kid if you want to feel like you want to have a kid. These are personal choices. Don't do it for any other reason. If you wouldn't do it for the state, you wouldn't do it for, religion. You wouldn't do it because the patriarchy forces you to do it. Why do it because another interest group, not have them because another interest group tells you not to have them? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But this is the environment we find ourselves in, guys. And it's going to be something that we're going to be talking about more and more and more as we go forward, because it's going to become more and more and more obvious what's going on.
Yeah. The higher the education, the less children, and the lower the education, the more children. Have you guys ever seen the movie Idiocracy?
No.
Oh boy, you got to watch.
This is it's somewhat hilarious, but also it's a very Malthusian population boom kind of a movie, so I don't necessarily endorse it.
Malthus was desperately wrong. Paul Ehrlich was desperately, totally wrong.
And he still says the same thing.
He could have just been standing on a rock like he was in Life of Brian, just shouting this stuff out, pretending that it was science. It was baloney. It was even baloney back then. And to laud him for saying what he was saying and continuing to say what he was saying, the data and the science are absolutely contrary to what he's saying. It's ridiculous. But because he was aligned with the people who are also alarmist, generally alarmist on these kinds of issues, a friend of our friend is, our friend here, we embrace him. And it's just like, man, oh man, is this what science is? Is this what science is? Because that's not what I thought science was.
Right. Yeah. It's more than picking the conclusions you feel are right. And so we need to re-examine some of these things. And what I want to start with examining is the idea that it is possible to reverse climate catastrophism or catastrophe by reversing our population growth. You talk about it, at least, so I assume it's in the book, that there is no correlation with a reducing population and climate recovery. It's humans, wherever we have gone, we have, sort of spread our industrialization and energy growth is a constant force at this point. And so, when we look at a world where our energy use is 2 to 3 times what it is today, no matter what our population is, we will eventually eliminate subsistence living, global poverty in that sense. We will have modern agricultural lifestyles for all communities across the world. And this has its own climate consequences, regardless of what the future population curve looks like. The question for all environmentalists out there is it's too late. And there's a lot of people I interact with who say, yes, it's already too late. You can't have a sustainable world with more than 2 billion people. Is that sort of supportable?
Well, that's a lot there.
Yeah.
Let me just say, the argument that I have about climate and population is as follows. Mm-hmm. If you believe that the activities of human beings were the reason for causing climate change, then if you reduce the number of people on the planet, you're changing the equation. You're changing the denominator in the equation. It's worth studying what the effect is. I don't think we know what the effect is. I think we're going to find out what the effect is, but nobody's really modeling it. There's been a couple of studies that have come out on this. It's a really critical issue in my view, very, very, very understudied. So I don't know whether if you reduce the global population, we'll be able to slow down the warming of the planet. I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on that. But what I do know is that we're about to go through a process that is entirely predictable over the space of the next 30 or 40 years relative to the shape of humanity that we need to get ready for, we need to prepare for, and almost nobody is talking about it. And we're going to run out of time before this hits us if we don't start preparing for it now.
We've got just a few minutes left. Let's dive into that. What is a possible strategy for preparation? Okay,
so the first two things that I would focus on, number one, healthcare. We need to start, and you can get into fairly, I would say, grandiose philosophical positionings on this. Personally, I like to keep it more practical. And the first thing that we have to start preparing for is long-term care and looking at methods for being able to take care of an older population that mostly allows people to stay in the houses that they have or the homes that they have. We have an entire female population that's going to go through a horrendous time going forward, in which younger women are going to be forced to not just take care of kids if they decide to have any, but also they're going to be put in a position where they're going to have a disproportionate responsibility for taking care of their aging parents. So what are we going to put in place for that? Long-term care and thinking about strategies for healthcare and how we're going to deal with that, I think, is critically important. And then the other one that I think is really, really important is to start rethinking what consumers look like. Our entire economy is structured around selling to young people. Marketers just do not pay any attention really to what's happening in terms of demography. And I think that, not just policymakers have to start paying attention to what's going on in demography and what's happening in terms of demographic change. So do marketers. And the problem that marketers have is they're stuck in 1970. They think it's all about the kids. But the truth is, it's all about their parents and their grandparents. Why? Because there's not as many kids as we think, and they've got very little money. We think there's going to be this huge transfer of wealth from older people to younger people. Well, older people are going to be living probably longer than they're living now, which means they're going to be holding on to that wealth for longer. But also, they're probably going to be spending more of it dealing with that first issue that we identified, which is dealing with the vagaries of aging and paying for healthcare services that they're not going to need to access. So that wealth transfer that may take place may not actually take place in the way that we think it is. One generation willing it to another. It's actually going to be transferred through the healthcare system and used to provide a better life for the people who are older. And what I would say to anybody who's a marketer who might be watching this is stop focusing on the kids and start focusing on the parents and the grandparents. Yes, we have to focus on the kids. Absolutely. No doubt about it. Youth still spend a disproportionate amount of their income on consumer goods, but stop treating their parents and their grandparents like they don't exist. Watch the music industry and you see everything that you need to see. Why does nobody watch the Grammys? Because nobody watches the Grammys. Oh, God. It's not because it's not relevant to young people. It's just that it's too relevant to the youngest part of the population.
I know. I can't listen to that stuff. I just can't.
Anyway, we write a lot about that in Empty Planet, and one of the example we use for marketers is Coachella versus what people call Odechella. Since you guys are on the West Coast, the most profitable, biggest, largest revenue music festival in the world is Coachella, except it was replaced one year by something called Desert Trip, in which there was no performer below the age of 70, and they made more money. If you make it for the older people, they still want to have the younger person's experience, but you have to be cognizant of the needs that they have.
Yeah. I'm in entertainment, and I got to admit, with the older acts, with the nostalgic acts, nostalgia is in, and it's not just the kids who want that fake nostalgia. It's actually the older generations.
Industry, if it wasn't making music money off of its legacy acts, it wouldn't be making money.
Yep. Talking about my generation.
Yeah, even the Who. There are some acts. Adele, maybe Rihanna can do something. Maybe there's a few that Beyonce would be able to do it, but it's not like a whole list of young artists that are producing their vital music right now that are selling out whatever the biggest concert venue is where you live. That just shows you where the economic power is, right? Older people have money. Why don't we make things for them? There's an opportunity here for people who can figure it out to actually market aggressively to that older population and bring them back into the mainstream. In fact, the mainstream is not millennials. The mainstream is actually their parents.
Yeah.
And that's because they're living longer. The fastest growing segment of the American population is people over the age of 65.
Yeah. And the old music has harmony, has melody, stuff that you don't get too much on the Grammys.
Well, as I've heard so many times, before there was Pro Tools, there were pros.
Yeah.
By the way, speaking of movies, you got to check out Idiocracy.
Oh,
the thesis is that all people who are dumb have lots of kids, and all the educated people have no kids. And as the generations go by, everybody turns into idiots. And these people are frozen in time, and they're like geniuses in a world of idiots. It's a great comedy, man.
There's a lot of stuff out there that basically is people are dumb. And I'm in the public opinion research business, and you can ask any question and prove that people are. I kind of find it too easy.
Yeah, that's true. That is true.
Yeah, I think people have a lot of native intelligence. I mean, we do a lot of dumb things. That's for sure. But what I do know is, just to sum this up, is we're going through a big change, and maybe it's idiocracy or for whatever it is. But John and I tried to get at it in that book. So I hope if people were watching this, I can promise you the following: there are no charts or graphs. It's not a data heavy book. It's basically like a travelogue. We just go from place to place to place to place and talk to people about what's going on in their country and reveal fascinating reasons as to why people are basically getting to the same point, which is not having any kids. And what you find out, it's cultural.
Yeah.
So there you have it.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. Our guest today has been Darell Bricker, author of Empty Planet: The Shock of Global Population Decline. And this is a really supportable thesis that we are looking at not just an AI singularity, but a population singularity. It'll be falling downhill in the middle of the night, down a mountain in the middle of the night. You don't know if you're going over a cliff or a gentle meadow. Something's going to happen, and we need to start preparing now before the universe decides for us. So thank you so much, Darell. Thanks, Gabe, for being an excellent co-host and producer. We look forward to anyone who wants to discuss this topic. Malthusian, pro-growther, progressive, neo-Marxist. It's all fair game for us. You can find us every Sunday now on twitch.tv/Soyattle. That's SOYATTLE. Like Seattle, take out the C, add in the soy. You can find us on YouTube at the Ecomodernist channel. You can find us on Facebook at the Ecomodernist Society of North America. And you can find us on many other networks, as we are here to spread sort of the ideas around a modern pro-technology humanity, a humanity that will endure for the eons. How do we achieve it? Thanks so much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Right.
Thanks a lot.
Emissions first, peace and justice will follow.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Ecomodernist channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.